Parshas Shemos. It's interesting. We take a look at the end of Parshas Vayechi. So the Baal HaMasorah there says that there are 85 psukim, because peh al peh, from one mouth to another. And I saw that Rabbi David Feinstein explains it based on having to do with the Masorah. Yaakov gives over to his children, and his children give it over to their children, etc. I think that peh al peh might have a different explanation. I know it's Parshas Shemos this week, but I want to compare Chumash Shemos with Chumash Breishis. Chumash Shemos is the beginning, in the sense of the mitzvos of the Torah. Of course, there are mitzvos in Chumash Breishis as well, and certainly there are many halachas that are deduced. But the format of Chumash Shemos is to tell over what happened with the Avos. Now, Chumash Breishis, is to tell us what happened with the Avos. So, but a person should not, chas v'shalom, think that Chumash Breishis is historical. It's not historical. It's Torah as much as Shemos is, as Vayikra is, as Bamidbar is, and as Dvarim is. And just as the Torah was given over from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe, personally, almost like peh al peh, so too Chumash Breishis was given over in that manner. But the format is different. In Chumash Breishis, for the most part, almost the whole Chumash Breishis, Torah is given over, but in talking about the lives of the Avos. In Chumash Shemos, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Dvarim, it's given over in talking about Moshe Rabbeinu in his role as the redeemer of the Jewish people. A matter of fact, the Gemara in Bava Basra says, Moshe kosav sifro uparshas bilam. Sifro means the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. So, to a certain degree, all the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, but certainly from Shemos onward, is talking about Moshe and his role as the Shaliach Hashem, as the agent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to redeem the Jewish people and to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. But I want to focus on the contrast, not just the similarity between Breishis and the other four Chumashim, but the contrast, the difference that, and specifically Breishis versus Shemos, the different approach of Chumash Breishis and Chumash Shemos. Now, and I want to do that by actually looking at certain psukim in Chumash Shemos, and Parshas Shemos, this week's Sedra, that deals, that I think it gives us a perspective of the theme of Chumash Breishis versus a theme of Chumash Shemos. Now, many suggest themes for the different Chumashim. The Ramban very, very often suggests, but I want to suggest something. Now, the Chumash Shemos opens up about the change that takes place in Egypt, where the Rashi already indicates about it in Parshas Vayechi. But the Jewish people were looked up, they were revered, they were the leader. They gave some form of leadership to the Egyptians. Yosef saved the Egyptians from starvation. And all of a sudden, a new king arises in Egypt. And then he warns the nation, and it's very interesting, and I think that this is very important. We say in the Haggadah, "B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalosenu." In every generation, there arises among the nations of the world to destroy us. Ela HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzileinu miyadam. God saves us from their hands, from their plans. And I think that it's important to understand that of course, we have to give Shevach v'hodah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have to thank God. And we don't even know to the degree for how much we have to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu from that perspective. There is a famous story. I don't remember if it was Rabbi Volozhiner or Ravitzel Volozhiner. I think it was Ravitzel, that the one of the ministers of the Tsar's cabinet, Ravitzel and Rabbi Volozhiner, they were the leader of the Misnagdim in Russia, in Lithuania, and very often they had to go to the capital to deal with members of the Tsar's cabinet, to speak on behalf of the Jewish people, to plead on behalf of the Jewish people. And especially Ravitzel, the leader of the Hasidim at that time in Russia, was the Tzemach Tzedek, who it's certainly the time of Ravitzel. And very often the two of them would go together to act on behalf of the Jewish people in Russia. And in one of the meetings that they had with the members of the Tsar's cabinet, so the minister and who met with them, he said, in the Bible, it talks about God saving the Jewish people so many times. You have the Exodus. You have the defeat of Amalek. Time and time again, go through Tanakh, not just in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. He says, where do we see it in contemporary times? Contemporary times being in the 1800s, in the time of Ravitzel Volozhiner, that miracles should be performed on behalf of the Jewish people. And Ravitzel said, truth is, I can't answer that question as well as you can. And the Tsar, the minister of the Tsar's cabinet said, why not? He said, because very often you make decrees, you meet to decide what decrees to make against the Jewish people. And I'm not privy to those meetings. I don't know what your plans were. But I know that very often those plans were frustrated. So even more than I know, how often God has helped us in saving us from your xeros, from your decrees. And the minister according to the way it was told over to me, admitted to Rav Itzela that was correct. That many times they had plans for decrees against the Jewish people. And for one reason or another, those plans did not come to fruition. But I think in addition to the fact that we have to give Shevach B'Hodah, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for all the times that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has saved us, I think the B'chol Dor V'Dor, Omdim Aleinu L'Chalosenu, is a warning to the Jewish people. You have to be on guard. Don't say it was just Paro. It wasn't just Paro. We have to be on guard. We can't say it's something of the past. That we live in a different society today. It's interesting. In last week's Sedra, it says that why is Parshas Ustuma, Parshas Vayechi, is sealed. Nistama Einehem v'liposehen shel Yisrael mitzoras hashibud shehischilu l'shabdam. Because in a certain sense, the slavery or the servile or giving the Jewish people a servile perspective of themselves began when Yaakov Avinu died. The eyes and hearts of the Jewish people were sealed. They didn't see. What is a Nehem Shel Yisrael and what does Libam Shel Yisrael mean? What and why in that order? But very often, when we see what's happening, and we're not happy with what's happening, we go into a state of denial. Who is a chacham? Someone who is roes hanolad. Someone who sees what is going to take place. He sees the tendency. He sees the trend. My grandfather, my mother's father, Rav Moshe Shurin. See, he was the Rosh Yeshiva in his town in Europe. And being the Rosh Yeshiva in his town in Europe, but he wasn't able to have ends meet. Things were difficult. The people in the town, Ritva was the name of the town. The people in the town did not have, certainly couldn't afford to pay a living wage. He had a very large family. So Les Brera, there was no choice. So he went to America for 5 years. He was the rabbi in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he after 5 years, and he would send money back to my grandmother throughout the 5-year period. And then after 5 years, he returned, and his having been the Rosh Yeshiva in the town. So they asked him, he was to speak. And he spoke. And he told the people in the town that I was gone for 5 years. You people have been here throughout the 5 years. And the difference between one day and the next day is very small. And each day, it's just a little bit worse. But the difference between today and yesterday is not that great. So you don't notice the difference. But I have been gone for 5 years. And I see the difference. You're scared to walk in your town in the evenings at night. He said, you have to leave. You have to go to America. And at that time, my uncle, Rabbi Yisrael Shuren, told me, he said he saw the people were smiling. They thought it was a joke. And then he wanted to take his whole family to America, but a lot of pressure was placed on him and on my grandmother. And at the end, they went to Eretz Yisrael. And then ultimately, from Eretz Yisrael, they went to America. And of course, wasn't many years later, but the whole town of Ritva was killed, was destroyed, was murdered by the Nazis, with the help of the people in the town. Sometimes when it's just a small difference each day, we dismiss it. But once we get used to dismissing it, we have trouble admitting that we were wrong. And even when it becomes more and more obvious, our minds were molded in such a fashion that we think there is no problem anymore. And I think perhaps that's what it was. The Nistam Eineihem Shel Yisrael, the eyes of the Jewish people. It was small at first, each day, just a small thing. They began the bondage. They began the discrimination. Matter of fact, it's interesting that the pasuk Shemos at the beginning of Shemos, Vayakam Melech Hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada es Yosef, and he ignored the Targum Yonas ben Eziel says he ignored the decrees that Joseph made to prevent discrimination against the Jews. He undid these laws. What is happening today in New York? On the first day, Vayokam Melech Chadash. And what is the answer of our left-wing Jews? Those who voted for him. Those who forgot the lessons of the past. We have to give him a chance. Let's give him a chance to arrest Netanyahu. Let's give him a chance to build up support against Eretz Yisrael. Let's give him a chance to make a movement. Let's give him a chance. And that's what the Jewish people in Egypt said. It's not just that we have to give Shevach v'Hodah HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the salvation that has taken place, but there's a warning to the Jewish people. Don't be stupid. Even when it's Nistam Einehem Shel Yisrael. But it shouldn't be Nistam Libam Shel Yisrael. In other words, and what is it? So what it is the same thing that happened in Egypt. The Jewish people wanted to be identified as Egyptians. That was even more important to them than being identified as Jews. Oh, they will have some signs show their Jewishness. Chazal tell us about the Jewish people, to their credit, that Lo Shinu Shmam, they didn't change their names. And we're not sure that we have that merit. Lo Shinu Malbusham, they didn't change their clothes. Lo Shinam Es Lashonam, they didn't change their language. Oh, so they were impressed because the mayor talked about eating lox with bagels. Oh, you see, he's a man who really finds favor with the Jewish people. How stupid could people be? But it's very easy to be stupid when you want to be stupid. And unfortunately, we live in a generation where people want to be stupid. Among Achenu Beis Yisrael. And I'm not talking now about just about those who are giving up the religion. I'm talking about those that are observant. But it's Nistamu Liban. They can't believe, we refuse to accept it. Until Vayamas Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, died, and nothing changed with Tal Shavasim Elakim at that point. But if not for the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent Moshe Rabbeinu, at that point, it would have all been over already. So it's important for us to understand that the when we say it takes time to forget. After the Holocaust, people remembered. But many years have passed, and all of a sudden, those that consider themselves intellectuals, what I find interesting is that it's those who consider themselves intellectuals that have become more stupid than those that don't consider themselves intellectuals. Why? Because those who consider themselves intellectuals have this feeling that they are somewhat superior if they identify themselves with Umos Olam. And when they identify themselves with Umos Olam, when they identify themselves with the nations of the world, there are people on the American political scene who seem to have a positive attitude to Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people, to Eretz Yisrael. And there are those that have a very negative attitude. They openly say, we'll arrest Netanyahu, whether they'll be able to do it or not. But they're initiating a form of thinking. And these people don't realize that by giving these people support, by saying the stupid comment, we have to give them a chance. It's similar to what the New York Times, which was at that time a Jewish newspaper, said when they interviewed Hitler, that he sounded somewhat reasonable. That people, there's a certain exaggeration. They gave him a chance to murder 6 million Jews. And he took that chance. So those the pseudo-intellectuals, who feel it's the intellectual thing to allow them to do these things. And even on the college campuses, a Talmud of mine told me that he had an encounter this week with a person, and the person was very, very upset that the Trump administration is taking away money from the universities that allow people to discriminate against the Jewish people, against the Jewish students. Okay, we understand that they're taking away the money for the activities that are anti-Jewish, but why should they take away the money from their medical research? And my Talmud said to them, or said to him, or them, I should say, my Talmud said, what would it be if it would be an African-American university? If it would be a university that spoke about African-Americans, that discriminated against African-Americans, would you suggest that they only take away the money from the programs of the white supremacists that they imagine are on campus? Or would you say remove we should not give aid to their medical research? And the person didn't have an answer to that question. They didn't know. You don't know? You don't know? It seems that, why is it that way? Because, in the contrary, they want to be chashuv. They want to be important. And if they identify themselves as Jews in the sense of the generations, They're not chashuv. They don't see the Jewish people as being chashuv. The chshivas, the importance, they only see themselves important if they, to a certain degree, we are Jews, but it's not who we really are. And that's b'chol dor b'dor omdim aleinu l'chalusenu. This is what happened in Egypt. We wanted to become like the Egyptians. It was more important to be an Egyptian than to be a Jew. Yes, there were certain things. There was no contradiction in our mind. But you know something? In the minds of the Egyptians, there was a contradiction. And the Egyptians resented that. And in many demonstrations now, when they, I heard that when they had the gay parade, certainly a left-wing cause. So those that wanted to march as Jews were not allowed to march as Jews. What does that tell you? It's not what does it tell you, what does it tell me about the left-wingers who are now at the forefront of the discrimination of the Jewish people. I want to know, where were all the left-wingers? And I was in favor of civil rights. And many Jews were there. And I'm asking, were these same Jews who were advocating on the behalf of civil rights, and we should advocate on behalf of civil rights, were they advocating on behalf of the Jewish students? And to what degree were they advocating? What it tells me is nistamu liban. Their hearts, their minds were closed. They're only motivated what they perceive will give them greater self-perception. Anyway, the Torah tells us about the birth in this week's Sedra. Torah tells us about the birth of Moshe, and then there was Xavier actually before. Every child, every Jewish child, male child that's born, has to be thrown into the Nile River. And Yocheved, not wanting to, she puts Moshe Rabbeinu, but no other choice. She puts Moshe Rabbeinu in a basket, prepares the basket that it shouldn't sink. And Miriam is Omed Merachok. Miriam stands from afar, watching the basket in which her brother, who will be the savior of Klal Yisrael, is. And then Basha, the daughter of Paro. It's interesting. Sometimes the salvation comes from another camp. Sometimes when many Jews make themselves subservient to the enemies of Klal Yisrael, the salvation comes from another camp, from outside Klal Yisrael. But Basha goes down, Lirchotz L'yor, Chazal tell us, sages tell us, Lirchotz L'yor, Megilulei, from the idols of her father, the way the Baal Turim explains it, and the Rishon of the Gemara. She went through Geras. Matter of fact, there is a dispute whether there was Dushas Yisrael, whether there was sanctity of the Jewish people in the time of the Avos, whether the Avos had Dushas Yisrael or not. Those the Mishnah Melchs are something very strange. He says that was the machlokes between Yosef and his brothers. I don't want to get into it now. Okay, whatever it is, and the Brisker Rav, and this was assumed. This was Reb Chaim, and everybody in our family assumed that since the time of Avraham Avinu, there was Dushas Yisrael, there was sanctity. The Shaila, whether Avram was a ger or wasn't a ger, but he certainly was the first Jew. Certainly was the first Jew. And there might be a question at what point he became a Jew. But clearly it seems that he became a Jew, even though there are questions that might even indicate before that he became a Jew from the time of the Bris Milah. That's the time when his name was changed from Avram to Avraham. It was a new identity. So she went to the Yor, according to the Gemara. She went to the Yor to be Tovel, to undergo Geirus. And the question I raised, and I'm only mentioning it here about Basya, simply because that's what's in this week's Sefer. We could ask it about the Mos. We could ask it about many. We know that Geirus requires Bezdin. Okay, there are Shitas that say there's some form of Geirus even without Bezdin, but we have to understand that. The question is, where was the Bezdin? Where was the Bezdin? Certainly Aaron wasn't there. When Basya went down, who was the Bezdin standing there when Basya was going down to go Geirus? How are we to understand? Okay, you could say that I prefer not doing it that way, but there are those who say maybe she wasn't a real Geirus. I don't know. From the Gemara, it appears it was a real Geirus. So how are we to understand this idea that Basya and so many others went through Geirus prior to Matan Torah? And the question is, where was the Bezdin for the Geirus? Where was the Bezdin for Avram's Geirus? Where was the Bezdin? Now, not in regard to that question. That question wasn't the question my father asked. My father was dealing with the Machlokas Rishonim, whether before Matan Torah being Jewish was dependent upon the father or upon the mother. But my father said, even according to the Shita, that being the Rabbeinu Tzorfas, the Ramban brings down an opinion that being Jewish was dependent upon the father before Matan Torah, not upon the mother. And there are psukim that seem to run smoothly according to that approach, but from the Gemara it doesn't appear that way. And many assume, and perhaps the Ramban himself assumed that way, that those who say that being Jewish before Matan Torah was dependent upon the father and not upon the mother, so they held that there really was no Dushas Yisrael. You were a Jew, but there was no sanctity involved. A Jew was like a member of another nation, whatever it is. However, my father did not learn that way. And my father said that everybody agrees. All, when I say everybody, I mean all Rishonim. My father said that all Rishonim agree that there was Kedushas Yisrael before Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah. There was the sanctity of the Jewish people. But as Rishonim say, at the time of Matan Torah, we know at the time of Matan Torah, at the time of the giving of the Torah, all of the Jewish people went through Gerus, they went through conversion. So the Rishonim say, the Tosfos Harash and Suvas, many say that was Tosfos Kedusha. They had to go through another Gerus, another conversion at the time of the giving of the Torah. Yes, they were Jewish beforehand, but in a sense, there was a greater Kedusha that endowed on the Jewish people at the time of the giving of the Torah. And in order to obtain that greater Kedusha, the Jewish people had to go through another Gerus, another conversion. And my father wasn't talking about that question. He was, but as I mentioned before, but my father defined what was the difference between the Kedusha, the sanctity that the Jewish people had at the time of the Avos, before the giving of the Torah, and the added Kedusha that the Jewish people had at the time of the giving of the Torah. My father said that at the time of the Avos, of the patriarchs, there was Kedushas Yisrael. There was sanctity. Certainly from the time of the Bris Milah, there was sanctity. But it was Kedushas HaYachid. It was the sanctity of the Jews as individuals. But as a nation, they attained Kedusha only at the time of Matan Torah. So today, we have, in a sense, two Kedushos, two forms of sanctity. One is an individual sanctity, and we don't have the ability just like that to separate the two. The two go together. And there is the sanctity. There is the sanctity of the Jewish people as a nation, and the reason there was a need for a new Gerus was for the Jewish people to enter the Jewish nation into the sanctity of the Jewish nation. They were Jews as individuals beforehand. But at the time of the giving of the Torah, they became Jews as a nation. And we could suggest that to a certain degree, that was part of the reason. By Matan Torah, by Yichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ohor, the Jewish people camped next to Mount Sinai. And our sages say that wherever they camped before, it says Vayachanu in the plural form. But when they camped at Mount Sinai, it's in the singular form, Vayichan. And the Medrash says, part of the Medrash, not the whole Medrash, is mentioned in Rashi. The Medrash says that when they camped at Mount Sinai, it was Ke'ish Echad B'Lev Echad. They were like one person with one heart. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, God said, let me use this opportunity to give them the Torah. It seems that the prerequisite for the giving of the Torah was for the Jewish people to be like one nation with one heart. And we could explain because the giving of the Torah is coupled. I've given other explanations for it in the past, and they both could be true. The giving of the Torah is coupled with the Jewish people being part of a holy nation, being part of a Goy Kadosh. So the that's the reason. That's the reason why they had the prerequisite. One of the reasons for the prerequisite of the giving of the Torah was for them to be like one, to be ke'ishachad, like one person with one heart. Now, I want to suggest that the din of Bezdin, what is the role of Bezdin when it comes to Gerus, when it comes to conversion? We could suggest that Bezdin acts on behalf of the Jewish people in accepting the Jews as part of the Jewish nation. So we could say that before Matan Torah, before there was this Kedushas Yisrael, the sanctity of the Jewish people as a nation, that there was only the sanctity of the Jewish people as individuals. So there wasn't the need. There wasn't the need for a Bezdin. But the sanctity of the Jewish people as a nation, in other words, the Jewish people had to be accepted. So there was a need for a Bezdin. We could say at the time of Matan Torah itself, perhaps there wasn't the need for a Bezdin because it was the Jewish people as a nation that underwent the conversion as one group, as one unit. But afterwards, the Jewish people who as a nation received the sanctity of the Jewish people as a nation now have to accept the Gerim who convert and who acts on their behalf in accepting them. That is the Bezdin. And we could say more than that. It's not just the Jewish people of this generation that accepts them, but the Bezdin might represent the Jewish people of all generations. In any case, therefore the need of a Bezdin for Gerus, there was no need for a Bezdin for the conversion before Matan Torah. But after the giving of the Torah, there was a need. Now, but it's very interesting. And the Brisker Rav, he mentions the Gerus of Bashia's proof that there was Dushas Yisrael, there was sanctity of the Jewish people. He doesn't go into the question national sanctity or individual sanctity, but he says, but how do we see that the Jewish people underwent that the Basha underwent Gerus? Where do we see it in the Psukim? And he says something that I would change it a little bit. But the Brisker Rav said that we see immediately after she goes through Gerus, she sees the basket. And she says, Miyaldei ha'ivrim. And she feels merciful on the baby, on Moshe Rabbeinu. And we know that the signs of a Jew are Rachmanim, Baishanim, and Gomlei Chasadim. Being merciful, doing kindness, and in a sense, Baishanim is a bashfulness, but not bashfulness in the sense of not taking, not doing what is necessary to be done. But bashfulness is not trying to be the center of attention. Rachmanim Baishanim. So he suggests that if she hadn't undergone Gerus, she wouldn't have had these traits. So I want to suggest something a little different. I feel, and I was once told, I never saw it inside, that the Chazon Ish said, I was at a Geirus conference, and the question was, in evaluating somebody for Geirus, of course, we need Kabbalas mitzvahs, the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. Someone said, and it's really a davar pashut, but today, even simple things, even things that a simpleton would understand, you have to quote somebody. Otherwise, how do you know it? There is no evidence for it. There is no raya for it, even though it's obvious. So it's part of the generation that believes that not only are we not trained to think, we're trained not to think. And when you think, you have to dismiss whatever you would think. In a sense, sometimes we can take the serval perspective of Egypt and bring it within the Jewish people to the extent that we don't think. And then when we don't think, it's not only we don't think about Jewish questions. The reason we see people today are not thinking because why? Because we have to submit. We need a servile perspective. And it's easier to change from one person who we submit to without thinking to another person who we submit without thinking, even though one is a Yerushalayim and all that, and the other is a Rosh Gomor, then to change our perspective and try to understand. Torah was given for us to understand. And if we don't understand, even if it's something that's told over to us by Gdolei Yisrael, that's part of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, to understand why. Because if we're not going to understand why, we will apply it in wrong situations. We see people signing all kinds of letters, and then they sign another letter, and then a third letter, taking back what they said. Why did they mistake in the first? Because it's part of their serval perspective. They don't try to understand. And when the first letter is servile, the second letter could be servile, the third letter could be servile. Whatever they sign is meaningless. So what I think is, I was told that the Chazon Ish, in one of his letters, writes that when it comes to Geirus, it's not just enough about halachas. Of course, this is halachas also. But you have to evaluate the midos of a person. In other words, it's important when a bezdin checks a person out, they have to, it's not enough to see, is he going to say Kriya Shema? Is he going to observe Shabbos? Is he going to put tefillin on? Is he going to daven? Is he going to observe kashrus? But we have to see his midos also. Rachmanim Baishanim Gom Lechasadim doesn't come automatically when you stick your head out of the mikveh. But you have to be Rachmanim Baishanim Gom Lechasadim. What can happen through the mikveh is for halachta b'drachav. After you become Jewish, you can understand the Rachmanis the midos for halachta bedrachav, that these are the midos of Hakadosh Baruch Hu. These are the traits of Hakadosh Baruch Hu. But if a person is not a Rachman before Gerus, he won't be a Rachman after Gerus. If he's not a Baishan before Gerus, he won't be a Baishan after Gerus. If he doesn't have an inclination to do kindness before Gerus, he won't have an inclination to do kindness after Gerus. And so I think what it is, when we take a look at when the Torah talks to us about conversions, about when a person first becomes a Jew. Avram Avinu, after his bris milah, immediately after the bris milah, Vayerav Lov Hashem, and then what happens? Three malachim pass by, and he doesn't even recognize that they're malachim. He assumes they're nomads, people walking in the desert, and he runs out. Gemilas chasadim. He gives them food, drink, gives them to drink. Bishon Tachasei, she gives them shade. He takes care of their needs. And then Avram Avinu pleads with HaKadosh Baruch Hu on behalf of the people of Sodom. Rachmanim, Rachmanus. And then when Torah tells us about Sarah, V'hinei ba'ohel, Sarah wasn't motivated by being the center of attention. The signs of a Jew, the signs of a Jew. So the Torah identifies that with Gerus. They demonstrated their Jewishness with the midos that they had. But if they hadn't had these midos beforehand, they wouldn't have had the midos afterwards. And the same thing is true. The Torah identifies the Gerus of Basia. Torah identifies the Gerus of Basia with saving Moshe, and even saying that he's Miyaldei Ivrim, even recognizing that it was a Jewish child. She felt a special obligation at that point. But if she wasn't the Rachman before, if she would not have been a Rachman afterwards. And do we need more proof? The book of Tanakh that deals with Gerus also deals with Milas Chasadim and with Rachmanis. Rus is the prototype of a Giores. Rus takes care of Naomi. She gives up everything to take care of Naomi. And that becomes part of her Jewishness. So, in a sense, we could suggest that the book of Shemos, if I were to contrast Breishis and Shemos, the book of Breishis is the development of Kedushas Yisrael of the individual, which is the foundation of the development of Kedushas Yisrael of a nation. The book of Shemos, that talks about the Jewish people as a nation. And but today, one is dependent upon the other. And today, I remember when one goes through Geras, he's assuming responsibility not just for his individual obligations, but he's assuming responsibility for the Jewish people. They have to be ki'ish echad b'leiv echad, one person with one heart. What we find interestingly happening today, that as people are giving up their individual responsibilities, they talk about Rahmanas, they talk about all that. You have people that talk about the people starving in Gaza, the terrible things, and when you show them other things, how many of these people, when they go to Israel, will go visit to see the areas on October 7th, to see what was done to the Jewish people before they scream it was made up? How many of these people that march, how many of the Jews that march with the Son of Israel, both orally and physically, when they go to Israel, and some of them do go to Israel, will go down to these areas near Gaza where children were put in the ovens? Well, they'll see the pictures of the children and the mothers that were standing there. So when you give up your responsibility to Am Yisrael, you lose your Rachmanis. Also, there is this perception that a Jew has to show Rachmanis to Son of Yisrael, but they don't have to show Rachmanis to their fellow Jews. Chumash Breishis and Chumash Shemos come together. In other words, if you're going to give up Rachmanis, if you're going to give up Rachmanis for Klal Yisrael, you're going to give up Rachmanis for all of mankind. There can't be Rachmanis as an individual for others unless you have Rachmanis that begins for your own people. And this is the contrast, but the similarity of Chumash, Breishis, and Shemos. Breishis represents the development of the individual Kedushas Yisrael, whereas Chumash Shemos is building on that to the Kedushas Yisrael of the nation. We have to dedicate ourselves to both the Kedushas Yisrael of us as individuals, as well as the Kedushas Yisrael of the Tzibor of Klal Yisrael as a nation. And those who reject the Kedushas Yisrael of Klal Yisrael ultimately will reject their own Kedushas Yisrael as individuals.
If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. I guess going back to what you said about your grandfather telling people they had to leave Europe because of the anti-Semitism, someone asked, how fast do Jews in New York need to move? And is that the priority, or should they legally fight Mamdani?
I think that if they would vote correctly, it wouldn't be a problem. They should run to the polling places and register. Then they won't have to run out. Any other questions?
For the people that did vote against him, what should they do?
Well, the people that voted against him, they should influence others to do the same.
I guess this is a little bit beyond the scope, but They have to vote properly in the governor election because that would help limit the powers of the mayor.
We have to know who's running first.
Right, it's a problem. Someone dropped out already.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay, so everyone have a good week. I don't see any
Yeah.
other questions here, so
Okay.
mm.
All right. Okay.